The slave was forced to marry her master's corpse. What she did at the funeral shocked everyone. The November wind slipped through the cracks of the Ashford mansion like a whispering ghost, carrying the smell of damp earth and dying leaves into the grand parlor. Candles burned low along the walls, their flames trembling in the draught, casting long, unsteady shadows across the polished floor. At the center of the room, beneath a heavy velvet canopy, rested an ornate mahogany coffin. Inside it lay Judge Montgomery Ashford, 67 years old, one of the most powerful men in this corner of Virginia, and very, very dead. In front of the coffin stood a woman in a silk wedding gown. Isabel. She was 24, with skin the color of burnished bronze and eyes that did not belong to a servant or a slave. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, survived too much, and refused to bend any further than she already had. Her gloved hands were bound loosely with a length of white silk ribbon, the way a bride's hands might be bound in some quaint ceremonial gesture. Except there was no living groom to take her fingers in his. The groom lay motionless, painted and powdered, his lips pressed together in a pale, final line. Around them, the room was filled with people who had come not for love nor for grief, but for spectacle. Plantation owners in dark coats and starched collars. Their wives in rustling silk, their necks heavy with pearls. Local officials, a handful of clergymen shifting uneasily in their seats. And near the front, standing stiff and outraged in mourning black, the 3 Ashford children. William Ashford, broad-shouldered and red-faced, gripped his cane so tightly the knuckles of his hand turned white. Robert, thinner, with restless eyes and a faint smell of whiskey clinging to him even this early in the day, stared at Isabel as if she were a poison that had seeped into his family's veins. Catherine, the eldest, held her handkerchief not to her eyes, but to her mouth, as though the sight of the woman in white physically sickened her. At the foot of the coffin stood the family's attorney, a narrow man with silver spectacles and a sheaf of papers in his hand. His voice droned through the room like an insect as he read from a legal document the guests had already heard once before and would likely remember for the rest of their lives. Being of sound mind, I, Montgomery James Ashford, do hereby declare that in the event of my death, the marriage contract between myself and Isabel shall be executed posthumously. Under the statutes of this Commonwealth, such a union, once duly witnessed and recorded, shall be considered valid for the purposes of inheritance. The words rippled through the room, a mixture of shock and fascination. A slave girl married to her dead master. A posthumous bride. In a house built on centuries of ownership, the law itself had been twisted into a knife. William could no longer contain himself. "This is madness," he burst out, turning on the attorney. My father was frail, confused. He must have been tricked, coerced. A man in his condition cannot consent to something like this. The attorney adjusted his spectacles calmly. The contract was signed 3 months prior to his passing, in full possession of his faculties. Witnessed, notarized, filed, all in accordance with the law. Robert let out a bitter laugh. The law? Since when does the law recognize a union between a gentleman and his property? Every eye in the room flicked to Isabel. She did not flinch. She looked instead at the coffin, at the still, painted face of the man who had once owned her, and felt nothing that resembled grief. What she felt was harder to name. A slow, cold churn of memory, a sense of standing on the edge of a cliff she had been walking toward for a very long time. Catherine's composure finally cracked. Her voice rose, thin and sharp. She bewitched him. That is the only explanation. Look at her, standing there like some lady of the house. My father was a respected judge, a pillar of Virginia society. He would never have chosen this of his own free will. Isabel lifted her gaze at last, turning to face them fully. The candles behind her traced a halo of light around the veil that hung from her dark hair. But there was nothing soft in her expression. "No," she said quietly, her voice carrying more power than any shout. "Your father made his choice very clearly." Murmurs stirred among the guests. No one expected a woman in her position to speak. William took a step toward her, fury etched into every line of his face. "You will regret this day," he hissed. "This farce of a ceremony, this insult to our name. You think a piece of paper makes you one of us." Isabel's lips curved, not in amusement, but in something colder. "I do not want to be one of you," she replied. For a single, suspended moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Candle flames steadied. Shadows paused. Even the November wind outside fell silent. Because Isabel knew what they did not. She knew what lay inside the sealed envelope in the attorney's inner pocket. She knew what was hidden in the small wooden box beneath the parlor floorboards. She knew what letters had already been sent out of the county, carried by hands that did not answer to the name Ashford. This was not just a grotesque wedding. This was the opening move in a war. But to understand why a woman who had once been bought and sold would willingly stand as the bride of a corpse, we have to leave this cold November morning and go back to the beginning, to the months when Judge Ashford was still alive and Isabel's chains were still visible to everyone but her. Before we step back in time, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? 6 months earlier, long before Isabel stood in a silk wedding gown beside a coffin, the world around her looked very different. In late spring, the Ashford plantation spread across the Virginia countryside like a kingdom carved from soil and sorrow. Rows of tobacco fields stretched toward the distant hills, the plants swaying in humid wind that smelled of damp clay and smoke from the curing barns. The slave quarters stood in a long, crooked line, the wooden cabins leaning under years of weather and wear, their roofs patched with whatever scraps the workers could find. Isabel lived in the second cabin from the end, sharing a narrow space with 2 older women and a little boy whose mother had been sold the previous winter. She slept lightly, woke early, and carried the weight of each day the same way she carried buckets of water from the well, without complaint, because complaint held no power here. Her tasks belonged to the big house. She washed linen until her knuckles cracked, scrubbed floors until they shone like bone, and helped prepare meals under the watchful eye of Mistress Ashford's steward, a cold-eyed woman named Mrs. Turner. Turner rarely raised her voice, but her presence alone was enough to stiffen the air in any room. If a pot burned or a plate cracked, the punishment was swift, though it never left Turner's own hands. She preferred to whisper orders to the overseer and walk away before the consequences began. Life in the big house followed rhythms Isabel had learned well. The clatter of silverware during breakfast, the creak of the judge's rocking chair on the veranda in the late afternoon, the footsteps of William pacing angrily after another argument with his father, the muffled sobs of one of the maidservants whose wrist bore a fresh bruise. Isabel kept her head low, her face composed, and her voice soft enough to disappear into the walls. It was safer that way. She had no family left on the plantation. Her mother had died of fever years earlier. Her father had been sold downriver when Isabel was 12. She learned early that survival came from silence, from keeping one's thoughts hidden behind calm eyes. But silence did not mean emptiness. Deep inside, where no overseer could reach, she held onto a small, stubborn ember of selfhood. That ember flickered the night Judge Ashford summoned her. It was unusual for him to call someone from the kitchen after dark. Even more unusual that he sent his personal servant to retrieve her rather than ordering Turner to do it. Isabel followed the servant up the long staircase, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. The hall lamps burned low, casting long shadows across the portraits that lined the walls. Ashfords of generations past, stiff and solemn, their eyes following her as she walked. The judge's room smelled faintly of laudanum and old pipe ash. He sat in an armchair near the fireplace, wrapped in a wool blanket despite the warm night. His once imposing frame had shrunken in recent years, leaving behind a man who looked carved down by illness and disappointment. Yet his eyes, pale blue and alert, still held a sharpness that could slice through any lie. "You may sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Isabel did not sit. "I prefer to stand, sir." He studied her for a moment. "Always careful. I've noticed that about you." She said nothing. He leaned back, exhaling with difficulty. "The physician came this morning. He tells me my heart will not hold through the winter." He tapped his chest lightly. "This old machine has nearly worn itself out." Isabel remained silent, unsure what response he expected. "I imagine you've seen the way my children look at me these days," he continued. "Waiting, always waiting. They circle like vultures, counting the minutes until they can divide what I built." Her gaze drifted toward the fireplace, its embers glowing faintly. She had seen it, William's impatience, Robert's resentment, Catherine's thinly veiled calculation, but she never imagined the judge would speak of it aloud. "They care nothing for me," he said, "only for what will be left behind." He paused, then added, "But I intend to leave behind something they will not expect." Only then did Isabel lift her eyes to his. "What is it you want from me, sir?" He studied her face. "I want to hurt them, not with violence, but with humiliation, with the law they love so much they believe they own it." He reached toward the small table beside him and slid a folded document across its surface. A marriage contract. Isabel did not touch it. "Sir, I don't understand." "You will," he said. "But know this. I intend to bind my estate to someone my children despise, someone they believe beneath them, someone who will make them choke on their pride every time they remember my name." Her breath caught. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. "I intend," he said slowly, clearly, "to marry you after my death." The words seemed to freeze the air between them. The faint crackle of the dying fire sounded deafening in the silence. Isabel's mind raced. Such a thing sounded impossible, absurd. Yet she knew enough of the law to understand that posthumous marriage, though rare, existed in certain states under specific conditions, and a judge, this judge, could exploit every loophole. "You wish to make me your wife?" she whispered. "I wish," he corrected, "to make you my heir, and to leave my children with nothing but their own sins." She stared at him, unable to disguise her shock. "But sir, if I sign this, they will come for me. They will ruin me." "No," he said. "Not if you learn what I teach you, not if you hold what I give you, not if you are braver than they expect." He leaned forward, his voice low. "I cannot save myself anymore, Isabel. But I can save you, and I can punish them." Her pulse thudded in her ears. A path lay before her now, dangerous, twisting, nearly impossible. But for the first time in her life, it was a path she could choose. The judge waited, and in the long silence that followed, Isabel understood something deeply. If she said yes, nothing in her life would ever remain the same. Before we continue, I want to ask you, where are you listening from tonight? In the weeks that followed Judge Ashford's astonishing proposal, life on the plantation moved with the same brutal rhythm it always had. Dawn arrived with the clang of the overseer's bell, and the workers filed into the fields with their tools slung over weary shoulders. Smoke rose from the curing barns. Horses snorted impatiently in their stalls. The sound of cracking leather drifted across the land as naturally as the cry of a hawk circling above. Yet for Isabel, everything felt different. It was as if the judge's plan had cracked open a seam in the world, revealing a new and dangerous landscape beneath. She could see people more clearly now. Every cruelty, every calculation, every unspoken threat. The overseer, Mr. Halcombe, seemed to notice her more than he ever had before. He was a heavy man with pale eyes that rarely blinked, a man who took pleasure in precision when he swung his whip, aiming not for chaos, but for control. When he passed the workers, they went rigid, their movements small and careful. Isabel felt his gaze lingering on her back whenever she walked across the yard with laundry baskets. One morning, he stopped her near the smokehouse. "You've been spending a lot of time in the big house lately," he said, turning a small knife between his fingers. "Judge Ashford working you harder than the rest, or treating you different?" She kept her face neutral. "I go where Mrs. Turner sends me." Halcombe's smile was slow and unsettling. "Well, you keep quiet and do as you're told, and you and I won't have any trouble." She dipped her head and kept walking. She didn't breathe again until she reached the kitchen yard. That small exchange settled a sharp truth over her. If anyone discovered the judge's plan too early, they would crush her before she even had a chance to defend herself. Inside the house, the judge's children were becoming restless in their own ways. William's temper exploded more frequently now. His arguments with his father shook the very walls. Doors slammed, servants scrambled, and Isabel learned through whispered conversations that William had already convinced himself he would inherit the estate. He spoke of expanding the fields, of buying more workers, of tearing down the older cabins and building new ones to increase productivity. Robert, meanwhile, drifted like a ghost through the halls, his breath always carrying the sour note of whiskey. He gambled with men from neighboring plantations late into the night, losing more money than he could repay. More than once, Isabel passed him in the corridor while he muttered to himself, cursing his father for not giving him control of the accounts. Catherine, the eldest, kept her malice wrapped in silk. She watched every servant with suspicion, and when she looked at Isabel, it was with an intensity that felt like a razor drawn across the skin. Catherine had the keen instincts of someone who recognized threats long before they announced themselves. "She dislikes you," Mrs. Turner whispered one afternoon as Isabel folded linen in the laundry room. "And Catherine Ashford holds grudges the way other people hold rosary beads." Isabel didn't need the warning. She had felt Catherine's hatred long before anyone spoke of it. But alongside the danger, something else was happening. Judge Ashford kept his word. In the quiet of late evenings, he had Isabel sit across from him in the lamplit study. He taught her the structure of property law, the meaning of legal precedent, the ways in which men of the South manipulated statutes to their advantage. He taught her how to read contracts, how to speak in courtly tones that demanded attention, and how to carry herself like a woman no one could dismiss. Sometimes he paused to catch his breath, his hand pressed to his chest. His illness was real, its grip tightening each week, but his mind remained sharp. And the more he taught her, the more Isabel sensed something shifting between them, something not built on affection, but on a recognition that they were both using each other for reasons neither needed to confess. One night, near the end of May, she walked back to the quarters after a lesson when she heard muffled cries near the rear of the stable. Curiosity and dread pulled her toward the sound. A young woman, barely 17, knelt in the mud while Mr. Halcombe stood over her with a switch in his hand. Her shoulders shook. Blood ran in thin lines down her arms. Halcombe did not strike wildly. He struck with a thinking man's cruelty, choosing places that would hurt most but heal quickly. "What did she do?" Isabel whispered later, when she helped the girl wash the wounds in the dim light of the cabin. "She dropped a tray," the girl said, her voice a cracked whisper. "Just a tray." Isabel sat beside her in silence, the heaviness in her chest becoming something darker, something sharper. She had endured these moments before. She had seen cruelty practiced like routine, like a form of language spoken fluently by the landowners and overseers. But this time, she could not push it aside. It pressed itself into her mind, into her bones, into the quiet resolve that had begun to grow inside her ever since the judge revealed his plan. "This," she thought, "is why I must win. Not for money, not for revenge alone. For every girl who bends beneath a blow she does not deserve. For every man buried in unmarked soil. For every life spent in a system built to break them." In early June, just as the summer heat began to thicken, Catherine summoned Isabel to her dressing room. The air inside smelled of perfume and powder. Catherine's voice was deceptively soft. "My father has taken an interest in you," she said. "More than I think he should." Isabel kept her gaze on the floor. "You would be wise," Catherine continued, "to remember your place here." Isabel remained still, her quietness a shield. But inside her, something rose like a storm beginning to gather strength. Because Isabel knew now, with a certainty that felt like destiny, that she was never going to stay in such a place. Not as a servant, not as a victim, and not as someone who walked with her head bowed. She was going to leave this world behind. But first, she would dismantle it, piece by piece. Before we move to the turning point of the story, let me ask. By midsummer, the air across the Ashford plantation had grown heavy with heat and tension, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Storms brewed on distant horizons, thunder rumbling just out of reach, and the workers in the fields felt it in their bones. Something was changing, something was coming. Isabel felt it more than most. She moved through the house with a quiet purpose now. Not as a servant following orders, but as a woman taking in every detail she might someday use. She memorized the layout of the judge's study, the location of the safe in the floorboard beneath the writing desk, the notes he kept about his children's debts, crimes, and betrayals. She learned which hall carpets muffled footsteps and which doors had hinges that did not creak. She studied the faces of the people around her with new clarity, seeing allies in some and danger in others. One evening in late June, she carried a tray of tea to the judge's room. His breathing had grown shallow, his voice weaker, but his mind remained unclouded. When she set the tray down, he gestured for her to sit. "You've learned quickly," he said. "Quicker than I expected." "You've taught me well," she replied. He studied her a moment. "You're afraid." She didn't deny it. "They watch me everywhere I go. Catherine especially. She knows something is wrong, even if she doesn't know what." "Good," he said, surprising her. "Let them suspect. Suspicion is weaker than proof, and proof is what you will have." He leaned forward, wincing as his heart fluttered painfully against his ribs. "It will get worse before it gets better. They will push, they will corner, and when I die, they will bare their teeth." Isabel met his gaze. "And if they try to kill me?" His eyes sharpened. "That is why I've given you everything." She hesitated, then asked the question that had haunted her since the night he told her the plan. "Why me?" He leaned back, his breath steadier now. "Because you're the only one in this house who still understands the difference between justice and inheritance." She left his room that night with her heart pounding. It was the first time she realized the judge had chosen her, not because she was weak, but because she was strong. 2 days later, the plantation erupted in quiet mourning. A young woman named Ruthie had collapsed in the fields. Heat stroke, Halcombe claimed. But the workers whispered differently. They had seen Ruthie stumble under blows that had no purpose except cruelty. She died at sundown, her body exhausted beyond saving. The overseer ordered a burial in the far corner of the grounds, without prayer, without song. The workers dug the grave under the moonlight, their faces hollow under the pale glow. Isabel watched from the edge of the clearing, her fists clenched. She had seen death before. She had seen suffering. But something about Ruthie's stillness, her youth, the injustice of it all, locked into Isabel's chest like a burning coal. When the grave was filled, the workers returned to their cabins. No one spoke. The only sound was the hum of cicadas and the distant cry of an owl. Isabel walked back alone. Halfway to the house, she saw a figure sitting on the steps of the laundry shed. It was Martha, the oldest house servant, whose hands carried a lifetime of labor in their twisted joints. "You saw it," Martha said quietly. "I did," Isabel replied. Martha nodded slowly. "This land takes people. Every year it takes more." Isabel sat beside her. "It shouldn't be this way." Martha looked at her sharply. "You think there's something you can do?" Isabel didn't answer. But Martha was a perceptive woman. She studied Isabel's face, the set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes, and her own expression shifted from curiosity to recognition. "You're planning something." When Isabel didn't deny it, Martha exhaled slowly. "Child, whatever you're thinking, be careful. People here get hurt for far less." "People are already getting hurt," Isabel said. "Every day." Martha closed her eyes. "Then you better be smart, and you better know who to trust." Isabel took a steadying breath. "Do I have you?" Martha opened her eyes again, and for the first time there was no fear in them, only resolve. "You have me," she said. "But only if you promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Don't die trying to save a world that doesn't want saving. If you fight to win." Isabel nodded. She had no intention of losing. That night, as she lay awake on her thin mattress, the storm that had threatened all summer finally broke. Lightning tore across the sky, thunder cracked overhead, and rain pounded against the cabin roofs. The storm matched the turmoil inside her, a gathering of rage, grief, and purpose. She understood what must happen now. She would not simply protect herself. She would dismantle the Ashford legacy brick by brick. And when the judge's children came for her, as she knew they would, she would not be the helpless girl they imagined. She would meet them with truth, with law, with the weapons their father had given her, and with a resolve built from every blow she had endured. By the time dawn returned, the storm passed, leaving a heavy stillness over the land. Isabel stood outside the cabin, breathing in the scent of wet earth, feeling the mud shift beneath her bare feet. This was the moment she awakened, the moment she understood there was no turning back, and the moment the coming war became inevitable. Summer slipped into autumn with a hush, as if the land itself were bracing for what was to come. The air grew cooler. The leaves along the drive to the Ashford house turned from green to rust and gold, and inside the great mansion, Judge Montgomery Ashford's heartbeat faltered a little more each day. By late October, he rarely left his bed. The physicians came and went, prescribing tonics that did nothing except stain his lips and dull his pain. Mrs. Turner spoke in whispers outside his door. William visited only to argue about money. Robert seldom came at all. Catherine appeared in perfect mourning, black weeks before there was anything to mourn, as if rehearsing for a performance she believed the world owed her. Isabel remained. She moved quietly around his room, changing linens, straightening papers, feeding the fire when the night air turned cold. Sometimes he slept, his breathing shallow and ragged. Sometimes he woke and asked for water. And sometimes, when the house was quiet enough, he asked for ink and paper. "We are running out of time," he murmured one afternoon as she adjusted his pillows. "Bring me the strongbox." The strongbox was hidden where few would think to look, beneath a loose floorboard behind the bookshelf in his study. She lifted it with both hands, feeling the weight of all it contained. Not just the metal and paper, but the power that would soon pass from one man to one woman in a world that believed neither should belong to her. She carried it upstairs, closed the door, and set it on the small table beside his bed. "Open it," he said. Inside lay neatly arranged documents: the revised will, the posthumous marriage contract, letters bearing the names of judges and sheriffs, records of William's cruelty, Robert's gambling debts, Catherine's suspiciously widowed status. There were receipts, sworn statements, copies of old court records. Isabel had seen some of them before in their late-night lessons. Now she saw them not as abstract evidence, but as weapons sharpened for a single battle. "Take out the envelope marked with your name," he said. She did. On the outside, in his careful hand, was written, "To be opened only after my death." "Keep that where no one can find it," he told her. "Inside is the deed to 30 acres of land on the far side of the creek, and the manumission papers that free you before any marriage is recognized. If anyone challenges your right to be my heir, that is where you begin." She swallowed. "You trust me with this much?" "You are the only one I can trust," he said. "My children would burn this house to the ground to protect their reputation, but they would never imagine entrusting it to you. That is their weakness, Isabel. They cannot imagine the strength of those they consider beneath them." He paused, struggling for breath, then continued. "The box itself will stay here, locked. My attorney knows where it is. When I die, he will come. He will see that the law is carried out exactly as I wrote it, but you must be ready. They will come after you with all the venom they possess." "What if the law bends for them?" she asked softly. "It often does." He looked at her with an expression that mixed regret and resolve. "Then you use the one thing they fear more than the law." "What is that?" "Exposure," he said. "Men like my sons can live with sin. They cannot live with shame." A few days later, in the quiet hours just before dawn, he woke with a clarity she had not seen in weeks. His eyes were bright, his voice thin but steady. "Come closer," he whispered. She leaned over him. "I am no good man," he said. "I've done many things in my life that stand against the judgment I once claimed to represent. I will not ask you to forgive me, but I will ask you this. Do not waste what I have given you." "I won't," she said. "Make them pay," he murmured. "Not only for me, for all of them, for the ones this house buried without a name." His hand tightened weakly around hers, then loosened. By the time the sun rose over the tobacco fields, Judge Montgomery Ashford was dead. The house reacted in layers. The first layer was practical. Messengers sent for the physicians and the attorney, curtains drawn in the front parlor, mirrors covered with black cloth. The second layer was performative grief. Catherine's carefully timed sobs, William's bitter muttering about unfair timing, Robert's drunken fury that his father had died before increasing his allowance. The third layer was fear, the quiet, creeping fear that passed like a shiver among the servants and slaves. The judge was gone. Whatever fragile balance had existed because of his presence, flawed as it was, had vanished with his last breath. The attorney arrived by midday, his hat in his hands, his eyes somber. He spoke briefly with Catherine and William, then requested that the immediate family and key witnesses gather in the study for the reading of the will. Isabel went, not as a servant with a tray, but as the person whose name lay on the first page of the document no one else had seen. The study felt different without the judge in it. The air seemed emptier, the chair behind the desk too still. William stood near the window, jaw clenched. Robert slumped in an armchair, trying to look composed and failing. Catherine sat perfectly upright, her gloved hands folded, her gaze fixed on the attorney. The attorney cleared his throat and began to read. He moved through the expected formalities first: charitable donations, bequests to distant cousins, the settlement of minor debts. William shifted impatiently. Catherine's lips pressed thinner. Robert's expression hovered between boredom and irritation. And then the attorney reached the heart of the document. "Regarding the disposition of my primary estate," he read, "including the Ashford house, associated lands, and all assets thereupon, I hereby declare that 40% of said estate shall pass to my lawful wife, Isabel, contingent upon the execution and recognition of our marriage contract. An additional 20% shall be placed in trust for the education and advancement of the freed people formerly held as my property, to be administered under my wife's oversight." The room froze. William surged forward. "What did you say?" The attorney did not look up. 40% to his lawful wife, Isabel." "That woman is a slave," William shouted. "She cannot be his wife, posthumous or otherwise." The attorney lifted his gaze now, meeting William's fury with an even stare. According to this document, Isabel was lawfully manumitted before the marriage contract was signed. At the time of the agreement, she was no longer his property. Catherine went pale. "Impossible. He would never—" "He did. the attorney said calmly. "There are witnesses on the manumission papers. The contract is valid. The law recognizes it." Robert sputtered, his face blotched red. "This is an outrage, a scandal. We will challenge it." "I anticipated you might say that," the attorney replied, "which is why your father included a contesting clause. If any of you attempt to dispute the will in court, you forfeit your portion entirely. In that event, the remaining 40% will also transfer to Isabel." The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. William's hand shook as he pointed at Isabel. "She did this to him. She twisted his mind. You all know what these people are capable of. She poisoned him, bewitched him." Isabel spoke for the first time. "I did not poison him," she said quietly. "His heart failed on its own, and he was not bewitched. He was disappointed." William spun toward her, eyes blazing. "You think this is over?" he hissed. "You may have a piece of paper, but you are still what you have always been." She met his stare steadily. "No, I am not." The attorney folded the will. "Your father also specified one condition," he added. "The marriage contract must be publicly acknowledged in a ceremony before his burial. Only then does the inheritance take full effect." "Absolutely not," Catherine gasped. "We will not stage a mock wedding between our father and a servant." "You may refuse," the attorney said softly. "But refusal voids your claim as well. His instructions were explicit." The days that followed moved with the strange, feverish pace of a nightmare. Word spread quickly through the county. The great Judge Ashford had died, and a spectacle unlike any other was about to unfold within his walls. The idea of a slave-born woman standing as bride to a corpse sent ripples of scandal through drawing rooms and taverns alike. Some people came to witness the event out of morbid curiosity. Others came because they hated the Ashfords and wished to see their pride brought low. Still others came because they had nowhere else to go but toward the loudest story in town. On the morning of the ceremony, the parlor was draped in black. The coffin lay open, the judge's face painted with the same careful hand that had prepared him days earlier. Candles burned in heavy brass holders along the wall. In front of the coffin, a space had been cleared. Isabel stood there in a plain dress of cream-colored silk. Not an extravagant gown, but respectable enough to mark the moment. Her hair was pinned back, her shoulders squared. She felt every eye on her, every murmur, every judgment. The family's pastor, summoned reluctantly to officiate, shifted uncomfortably with his Bible in hand. He had argued against this, but the attorney had reminded him that the law outranked his discomfort. Now he stood in front of the coffin, clearing his throat. "We are gathered," he began, voice thin, "under solemn circumstances, to honor the final wishes of the late Judge Montgomery Ashford." The words washed over her. She heard them, but she heard other things too. The rustle of silk, the creak of floorboards, the quiet intake of breath from those who had never seen a black woman stand in a place reserved for white brides. At the front of the room, Catherine stared at her with undisguised loathing. William glowered like a storm barely contained. Robert looked as though he might be sick. When the pastor finished the necessary lines and asked if she accepted the vows as written in the contract, Isabel answered clearly, "I do." The words echoed in the hush that followed. It was done. Whatever else anyone believed, however much they seethed, the law had been satisfied. Isabel Ashford existed now, not only as a name whispered with contempt, but as a legal fact. The next day came the funeral. This time, the room was even more crowded. Politicians, judges, landowners, and their wives filled the parlor and overflowed into the hall. Many had come not to mourn, but to witness how the Ashford children would handle their humiliation. Would they pretend acceptance? Deny the marriage? Tear down the woman at the center of it all? Isabel entered late, dressed in mourning black, a simple veil draped over her face. The room murmured when she appeared. Some gaped openly, some looked away. A few, just a few, looked at her with something like curiosity rather than disdain. She took her place near the front, opposite William, Robert, and Catherine. The pastor spoke again, this time of ashes and dust, of the brevity of life, of judgment beyond earthly courts. When he finished, he invited the family to say a few words. William rose to his feet instead. "I will not let this mockery stand without protest," he announced. "My father was not in his right mind. He was exploited in his weakness. This woman—" "Enough," the attorney said sharply. But William did not stop. "This woman has tricked the law and all of you, but she will not trick God, and she will not trick Virginia. She is nothing but a—" "Careful," Isabel said quietly. The single word cut through the air sharper than any shout. Eyes turned to her. The room held its breath. She stepped forward, one small wooden box in her hands, the same box she had retrieved from beneath the floorboard after the judge's death, as his instructions had allowed. "You say I tricked your father," she said. "You say he was confused, that he didn't know what he was doing." She paused. "Let me show you how clearly he saw." She opened the box. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, were bundles of documents, letters, receipts, statements bearing official seals. She lifted one. "This," she said, "is a letter from William Ashford to a woman in Richmond, dated June of 1848, in which he begs her to increase the dosage of laudanum she was slipping into his wife's tea, assuring her that no one will suspect a thing." A murmur swept the room. She held up another. "This is an account ledger showing that Robert Ashford lost more than $80,000 at gaming tables over the last 5 years, much of it pledged against property that did not belong to him but to his wife's family." Robert's face went gray. "And this," she said, lifting a third document, "is a sworn deposition taken by your father from a maid who witnessed Catherine Ashford mixing arsenic into her first husband's medicine." Catherine lurched to her feet, trembling. "Those are lies. Forged. Stolen." "They are copies," Isabel said calmly. "The originals were placed in your father's custody years ago. He kept them, not because he wished to protect you, but because he wished to punish you when the time came." She turned, addressing not just the siblings, but the entire room. "You wished to know why he married me after death. It was not love. It was judgment. He chose the one person you would never accept and placed his fortune in her hands, along with the record of your sins, because he knew you would never be able to bury both." William started toward her, fists clenched. "You think a handful of papers can ruin us?" "No," she replied, "but 3 deliveries already in motion can." And then she spoke the words that shattered whatever illusion of control remained. "3 days ago, according to his instructions, I sent complete copies of these documents to the county sheriff, the circuit court in Richmond, and a newspaper editor in Philadelphia. By now, they have likely arrived." The room erupted. Voices rose in disbelief, outrage, panic. The pastor stepped back, shocked into silence. Some of the guests began to edge away from the Ashford children, as if scandal were a contagion they might catch by standing too close. The attorney did not move. His eyes were fixed on Isabel with something like grim respect. William reached her in 2 strides and grabbed her wrist. "You've destroyed us," he hissed. She met his gaze without flinching. "No," she said. "You destroyed yourselves. Your father merely left a record. I delivered it." Behind them, at the open doorway, the sound of boot heels rang against the floor. Uniformed men stepped inside. Deputies from the sheriff's office, their faces set, their presence undeniable. One of them cleared his throat. "William Ashford, Catherine Ashford, Robert Ashford," he said, reading from a folded paper. "By order of the county court, you are hereby placed under arrest pending investigation into charges of fraud, conspiracy, and murder." The house, once a symbol of power and untouchable status, had turned against its own blood, and at the center of it all stood Isabel, the woman they had once called property, now holding not a whip, not a weapon, but something far more dangerous in her hands. The truth. The days following the arrests unfolded with an eerie stillness, as though the Ashford plantation itself was holding its breath. The deputies' wagons rolled down the gravel drive carrying William, Catherine, and Robert away in iron restraints, their shouts echoing between the distant pines. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the mansion, once a symbol of unshakable power, felt hollow, drained of the arrogance that had filled it for so many years. Word traveled fast across Virginia. By morning, newspapers from Richmond to Norfolk carried the headline, "Judge Ashford's children charged in shocking scandal." Some articles spoke cautiously, others spoke boldly, hungrily, relaying every detail of the accusations. Murder, theft, fraud, and decades of corruption hiding behind a polished family name. The county sheriff visited the plantation the next afternoon to take official statements. Isabel sat with him in the parlor, her hands folded in her lap, her voice steady as she recounted the judge's final weeks, the documents he left behind, the reasons he had chosen her to inherit his estate. The sheriff listened carefully. When she finished, he leaned back and studied her with a long, measured gaze. "You've done something most folks wouldn't dare try," he said quietly. "You've cracked open a house that's gone untouched for generations." "It wasn't bravery," she said. "It was necessity." "Call it what you like," he replied. "But the truth is the truth, and it's out now." For the first time in her life, Isabel felt the law tilt toward her instead of against her. Not fully, not safely, but enough to give her room to breathe. Outside the mansion windows, freedmen and enslaved workers whispered the news to one another. Some prayed. Some wept. Some stood in silent awe that a woman who had once scrubbed floors in the big house now sat in the judge's parlor, giving testimony to the county sheriff. That evening, Martha knocked softly at her door. "You did it," she whispered when Isabel let her in. "You truly did." "Not yet," Isabel said, "but the truth has moved. That's a start." Martha clasped her hands. "Your mother would be proud." The words struck Isabel deeply. She swallowed against the sudden tightness in her throat. "I hope so," she said. The trial began in January of 1852. Winter settled thick across the state, frosting windows and bowing the branches of old oaks. The courthouse in Richmond overflowed with spectators each day, the public hungry for scandal, justice, or both. Judges, lawyers, newspapermen, farmers, widows, abolitionists, people from every corner of society came to witness the fall of the Ashfords. Isabel attended only when summoned. She did not crave the spectacle, nor did she wish to stand in the center of it more than necessary. But when she took the stand, she did so with a quiet strength that even the prosecuting attorney remarked upon. She spoke clearly of the judge's instructions. She explained how he taught her law, how he prepared documents, how he feared his children and sought to prevent them from destroying his estate. She offered the truth without theatrics, only calm resolve, the kind that could not be shaken once firmly rooted. The defense tried to discredit her, of course. They questioned her literacy. They questioned her motives. They questioned her right to be free. But each time they attempted to pull her apart, another witness knitted her story back together. The county clerk who verified the manumission papers, the attorney who recorded the will, the physician who confirmed the judge's clarity of mind, the servants who had overheard William's violent arguments or seen Robert's gambling losses, the neighbor who testified that Catherine's first husband had shown symptoms of arsenic poisoning for months before his death. Piece by piece, the siblings' world collapsed. On the final day of testimony, a silence settled across the courtroom as the judge read the verdict. William Ashford was found guilty of conspiracy to murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Robert Ashford was convicted of fraud and embezzlement, serving a lengthy sentence that would shadow whatever remained of his future. Catherine Ashford, charged with poisoning her first husband, fled the state before sentencing. She was never seen in Virginia again. When the gavel fell, the room erupted with murmurs, some triumphant, some horrified, some simply stunned. But Isabel did not celebrate. She simply closed her eyes and exhaled, long and slow, as though finally releasing a breath she had been holding for years. It was done. Returning to the plantation after the trial felt like stepping into a different world. The mansion was quiet now, stripped of its menace. The judge's old chambers remained untouched. The fields were still, waiting for spring. And the workers, those who had once carried the weight of Ashford cruelty on their shoulders, stood at the threshold of a future none of them had imagined. Isabel gathered them in the yard one cold morning. The fog clung to the ground, swirling around their feet. They waited, uneasy, unsure. She spoke plainly, the way her mother once taught her to speak truth without fear. "You are free," she said. "All of you." Ooh, the words rippled through the crowd like a warm wind sweeping across frozen earth. Some gasped. Some fell to their knees. Some clung to one another and cried. Martha covered her face with trembling hands. Isabel raised her chin. "The judge left a portion of this land in my care," she said, "and I am choosing to give much of it to you. 30 acres will remain mine by law, but the rest will be divided fairly. You will own your homes. You will plant your own crops. You will answer to no master." A long silence followed, the kind that comes when a life has changed so suddenly that the heart needs time to catch up. Then a young man stepped forward. "Miss Isabel," he said, voice cracking, "what will you do now?" She thought about it, truly thought about it, for the first time. "I will build something new," she said softly. "Something better than what was here before." And she did. Over the next several years, under her guidance, the land slowly transformed. The slave quarters became small homesteads. The fields became cooperatives. With money from the estate, she built a school where children, black and free, learned to read, to write, to dream. She hired teachers from the north, fed families who needed help, and sent letters through the Underground Railroad to guide others to safety. People began to speak her name far beyond Virginia, Isabel Ashford, a woman who rose not by violence or revenge, but by strategy and truth. By the time the Civil War erupted, she had become a quiet force in abolitionist circles, and when freedom finally became law rather than a distant hope, she stood among those who rejoiced, tears slipping down her cheeks as though she were finally exhaling all the years of captivity from her lungs. In her later years, she lived in a modest home near the edge of the land she once worked as a slave. Children visited her porch to hear stories. Teachers visited for guidance. Widows and widowers visited for comfort. She became something of a legend in the county, an unlikely figure who carried a legacy of bravery not in scars or violence, but in the power of her mind. When she died at 65, the school she built hung a wreath on its front door. The plantation, now a community of free families, lined the road to the cemetery, singing low, gentle hymns their grandparents once whispered in secret. Her tombstone bore only her name. Isabel, born in bondage, died in freedom. And beneath that, a line she wrote herself, years before her death. Justice is not born from strength, but from the courage to use truth when truth is all that remains. The wind moved through the grass, quiet and steady. And somewhere in the distance, as though echoing her roots, an old spiritual rose into the sky. Before we close this story, let me ask you, just as Isabel once asked the world, where are you listening from tonight?